Ida for divorcing my cheating wife? Hi, fellow Redditors. I hope you're doing well. I'm in a very difficult situation and need your advice. I, a 28-year-old man, married my wife, a 27-year-old woman, about 2 years ago. Our story began during our university days, where we met as classmates. Initially, she was just another face in a sea of students, but over time, our connection grew. What started as casual conversations during group assignments and late-night study sessions evolved into something deeper. We shared dreams, laughed about our pasts, and built a future we thought was solid. After dating for about a year, it felt natural to take the next step and get married. Life seemed idyllic. We didn't face any significant challenges that many couples encounter early on. Financially, we were stable, thanks to dual incomes and shared responsibility for managing expenses. Emotionally, we were connected, our goals aligned, and we shared an eagerness to build a family. To everyone who knew us, we were the epitome of a happy couple. About 10 months ago, everything changed. It was a regular evening when she called me into the living room, her face pale and her voice trembling. She told me she was pregnant. My reaction was immediate joy. I had been dreaming of the day we'd start a family. For months, we'd talked about how wonderful it would be to have a child, to bring a little life into the world who would carry parts of both of us. But as I stood there, elated, I noticed she wasn't smiling. Her expression was distant, her body language tense. At first, I chalked it up to shock. After all, pregnancy is a significant milestone, and the realization of it can hit people differently. I reassured her, pulling her into a hug, promising her that we'd figure everything out together. Her silence lingered, and that night, as I lay in bed dreaming about the future, she tossed and turned, her restlessness filling the room like static. In the weeks that followed, her mood began to shift. She was no longer the woman I had known for years. She grew irritable, snapping at small things that would have previously made her laugh. At first, I attributed her behavior to hormones. I'd heard from friends and read online that pregnancy hormones could wreak havoc on emotions. Determined to be a supportive husband, I doubled down on patience, telling myself this was temporary. I cooked her favorite meals, handled more chores, and took her on little dates to try to lighten her mood. But the moments of warmth between us became fewer. One day, out of nowhere, she brought up the idea of abortion. Her voice was flat, almost detached, as she said she wasn't sure if she wanted to keep the baby. I was stunned. Why? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She avoided my eyes and muttered something vague about feeling unprepared. Unprepared? How could that be when we'd planned this? I pleaded with her to reconsider. I reminded her of all the times we'd stayed up late imagining life with a child, the name lists we'd written, the nursery ideas we'd sketched out. Her eyes flickered with something I couldn't decipher, and she gave a curt nod before walking away. In hindsight, I regret not pressing her further. There was something deeper lurking beneath the surface, something her words weren't revealing. But I chose to trust her, to believe that this was just another wave in the turbulent sea of pregnancy emotions. Perhaps, I thought, she just needed time to adjust. As the weeks turned into months, I held on to the hope that she'd come around, that her initial apprehension would dissolve into excitement. After all, wasn't it common for first-time parents to feel overwhelmed? Little did I know, the foundation of our marriage, our trust, our love, our shared dreams was already beginning to crack, and the storm that was about to hit would shatter everything I believed in. About a month and a half ago, my world unraveled in ways I could never have imagined. It was an ordinary evening after a long day at work. I parked my car in the driveway, stepped into the house, and called out to my wife, expecting the usual hum of life in our home. Instead, I was met with an eerie silence. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating, as if the walls themselves were bracing for what was about to come. I found her sitting in the dining room, her head buried in her hands, her shoulders trembling as soft sobs filled the air. My heart immediately sank. "What's wrong?" I asked, stepping toward her. She didn't look up at me, her sobs growing louder, her body shaking uncontrollably. The sight of her like this unnerved me. My mind raced, trying to piece together a reason. Perhaps it was something related to the pregnancy, or maybe a bad day, or even some old worry she hadn't shared. But nothing could have prepared me for her next words. Between gasps and broken sentences, she confessed. She had been unfaithful. The words hit me like a physical blow, each one sharp and deliberate. She had slept with another man. And not just any man, someone she had known for years, the brother of one of her friends. My mind froze. Everything around me seemed to blur, her words ringing in my ears like a relentless echo. My legs felt weak, and I sank into the chair opposite her. The life we had built together, the plans for our future, the child we were expecting, it all felt like a lie. My chest tightened as I tried to comprehend the betrayal, but there was no making sense of it. She kept talking, apologizing through her tears, trying to explain. She said it was a mistake, a moment of weakness. But the details, the timeline, none of it mattered to me at that moment. What mattered was the undeniable truth. The child she was carrying, the child I had already begun to love in my heart, was not mine. I couldn't find the strength to speak. I just sat there, staring at her, my thoughts spiraling. The person I had trusted most in the world, the woman I had vowed to spend my life with, had shattered that trust. The enormity of it all was too much to bear. Eventually, I managed to stand up, though my legs felt like they might give way beneath me. I told her, in a voice I barely recognized as my own, to go and rest, that we would talk about it in the morning. She reached out to me, grabbing my arm, her sobs intensifying. "Please, forgive me," she kept saying, over and over again. I couldn't respond. I couldn't even look at her. I gently pulled my arm free and walked into the dining room, leaving her behind. I spent the entire night sitting in that chair, my thoughts racing and my emotions in turmoil. Anger, sadness, confusion, betrayal, they all swirled within me, making it impossible to find any clarity. I thought about the life we had shared, the love I thought was unshakable. I thought about the child I had dreamed of holding in my arms. And I thought about the man she had turned to, wondering what he had that I didn't, what had drawn her to him. When dawn finally broke, I felt numb, as if the night had drained every ounce of emotion from me. I heard her footsteps as she hesitantly entered the room. She looked fragile, her eyes swollen from crying, her voice barely above a whisper as she asked if we could talk. But I had already made up my mind. I told her to pack her things and go to her parents' house. Her face crumpled, and she immediately began pleading with me, her voice desperate, her hands clutching at my arms. "Please," she begged, tears streaming down her face. "Don't send me away. I'll do anything to fix this." But I couldn't bear to have her in the house any longer. The betrayal was too fresh, too raw. I told her firmly that she needed to leave, that I needed time to think and decide what to do. When her pleas didn't subside, I called her brother, asking him to come and take her. He arrived quickly, and without asking too many questions, he helped her gather her things. She looked at me one last time before leaving, her eyes filled with a mixture of regret and sorrow. I didn't say anything. I couldn't. Once she was gone, the silence in the house was deafening. I sat alone, trying to process what had happened. But every corner of the house felt tainted, every memory suddenly overshadowed by the revelation of her betrayal. I needed to take action, to regain some sense of control over the chaos that had consumed my life. The first thing I did was contact a divorce lawyer. I explained the situation, laying out the facts as best as I could without letting my emotions get the better of me. Thankfully, we had a prenuptial agreement in place, one that was very clear on the matter of infidelity. If either of us committed adultery, the other would retain all shared assets. It was a small solace, knowing that the legal aspect of the separation would be straightforward. But the emotional toll was far from simple. As I began to prepare for the divorce, I couldn't help but replay every moment of our relationship in my mind, looking for signs I might have missed. Had there been cracks in our marriage long before this? Were there moments where she had pulled away and I hadn't noticed? The questions were endless, and the answers were elusive. I thought about the child she was carrying, the innocent life caught in the middle of this mess. I knew it wasn't his fault he hadn't asked to be brought into the world under such circumstances. But I also knew that I couldn't be a father to him, not when every reminder of him would be a reminder of her betrayal. The days that followed were some of the hardest of my life. I wrestled with my emotions, trying to make sense of everything, trying to find a way forward. And though the path ahead was unclear, one thing was certain: I couldn't go back to the life I once knew. The trust had been broken, and there was no repairing it. 2 days after I sent my wife away to her parents' house, the chaos that had temporarily abated came back with full force. My phone wouldn't stop buzzing calls, texts, and even voicemails from numbers I didn't recognize. Her family, it seemed, had decided to involve themselves. At first, I ignored the calls, blocking numbers one by one. But their persistence was unrelenting. The texts ranged from accusatory to pleading, and the voicemails were full of demands for me to be reasonable or hear her out. I ignored it all. Then, it happened. They showed up. Late in the afternoon, I heard a knock at my door. I peered through the window, and there they were, my wife, her parents, and her sister, all standing on my front porch. My stomach sank. I had hoped to avoid a confrontation, but there was no turning back now. I opened the door, stepping outside to keep them from coming into the house. Her mother's face was red with anger, her father's expression unreadable, and her sister looked uncomfortable but resolute. My wife, standing at the back of the group, had her head lowered, tears streaming down her face. "Why are you acting this way?" her mother demanded, her voice rising with every word. "You can't just throw her out like this. She's pregnant, for God's sake." I took a deep breath, keeping my tone calm despite the storm raging inside me. "Why don't you ask her why I'm acting this way?" For a moment, there was silence. Her family turned to look at her. She hesitated, her shoulders shaking as she tried to form the words. Finally, she confessed. "Right there on my front porch," she admitted to the affair. She said it wasn't planned, that it was a mistake, a lapse in judgment. She spoke in halting sentences, her voice barely above a whisper, but every word was a dagger to my chest. Her mother gasped, her expression a mixture of shock and disbelief. Her father's face darkened, and her sister's eyes widened. But it wasn't over yet. As if things couldn't get worse, her mother and sister revealed that they had known about the affair all along. They claimed they hadn't wanted to hurt me, that they thought it was just a fling and would blow over. Their justification was hollow, their betrayal cutting nearly as deep as hers. I felt a surge of anger I hadn't known I was capable of. The weight of their collective deception was unbearable. I told them, my voice firm and unwavering, to leave my property immediately. I informed them that divorce papers would be sent to her shortly and that I wanted a paternity test as soon as the baby was born. My wife, unable to contain herself, fell to her knees on the porch, sobbing and begging me to reconsider. "Please, give me a chance to fix this," she cried, her voice breaking with desperation. I didn't let her finish. I turned to her family and told them that if they didn't leave immediately, I would call the police. They finally left, her father practically dragging her to the car while her mother muttered something under her breath. I stood there, watching as they drove away, the sound of the car fading into the distance. Once again, the silence in the house was deafening. The following day, her father called me. His tone was measured, almost apologetic. He said he understood my anger but that I needed to think about the bigger picture. He offered to buy me a house and a car if I forgave his daughter and took her back. The offer made my stomach turn. It wasn't just insulting, it was an attempt to erase the damage with material things. I refused outright, telling him no amount of money or gifts could fix what had been broken. From that point on, the harassment escalated. Her family bombarded me with calls and texts, alternating between pleas for forgiveness and accusations of cruelty. My wife's messages were more personal. She apologized repeatedly, begged for a second chance, and claimed she still loved me. But as the days went by, her tone shifted. She started sending me messages that were darker, more troubling. She said she couldn't live without me, that she would harm herself and the baby if I didn't take her back. I didn't reply to any of her messages. Instead, I documented everything. I knew that the situation was spiraling into dangerous territory, and I wanted to ensure I had evidence if things escalated further. About 10 days ago, she gave birth to a baby boy. Despite her family's attempts to stop me, I insisted on a paternity test. I needed the truth, even if deep down I already knew what the results would be. The test results came in yesterday. As expected, they confirmed that I was not the father. Holding that piece of paper in my hands, I felt a mixture of relief and heartbreak. Relief that the truth was finally indisputable, but heartbreak for the life I had envisioned and the child I would never call my own. With the results in hand, I immediately sent the finalized divorce papers to my wife. There was no longer any doubt in my mind about what needed to be done. This chapter of my life, as painful as it had been, needed to end. Her family hasn't stopped their attempts to sway me. Her mother called again this morning, pleading with me to forgive her daughter, to give her a chance to make things right. She even admitted that the baby's biological father had disappeared as soon as he heard about the pregnancy, leaving her daughter to face the consequences alone. I told her, as calmly as I could, that this was not my mess to clean up. I reminded her that her daughter's actions had consequences, and I wasn't responsible for saving her from them. Then, I asked her not to contact me again. I don't know what the future holds, but I do know this: I deserve better. I deserve honesty, loyalty, and love. And while the road ahead may be lonely for a while, I'd rather walk it alone than remain in a life built on lies. Now, her family continues to reach out, pleading, cajoling, and even attempting to guilt me into changing my decision. They insist she made a mistake, a single lapse in judgment, and that it's my duty to be the bigger person, to forgive and move forward for the sake of the family we had planned to build. Her mother's voice was raw with desperation during her most recent call, as though she believed that the intensity of her plea might change my mind. She loves you, her mother said, her words trembling. She knows she messed up, but love is about forgiveness. You've been through so much together. You can't just throw it all away over one mistake. Please reconsider. It was almost surreal to hear her paint my wife's actions as a mistake, as though it were a simple slip of the tongue or an error in judgment. But no, this wasn't a mistake. A mistake is leaving the oven on overnight or forgetting to pay a bill on time. Infidelity, lying, concealing the truth, and carrying another man's child while letting me believe it was mine? That wasn't a mistake. It was a series of conscious choices, each one cutting deeper than the last. In response, I asked the one question that I knew would cut through the facade: what about the baby's father? Her silence was deafening at first. Then, after a deep sigh, she admitted the truth. He ghosted her, she said quietly. As soon as he found out about the pregnancy, he disappeared. We don't know where he is now. I let her words hang in the air, heavy and unresolved, before calmly responding. This is not my mess to clean up. Your daughter made her choices. Now she has to live with them. Please, don't contact me again. And with that, I ended the call. That night, the messages from my wife began. They were frantic, emotional, and manipulative all at once. At first, they were pleas for forgiveness. She poured out her heart in long paragraphs, detailing how much she regretted what she had done and how she still loved me. She claimed she would do anything to make things right, though her words felt hollow after everything that had happened. When I didn't respond, the tone of her messages shifted. She started threatening to harm herself and the baby if I didn't take her back. Each message was more alarming than the last. She described how she couldn't live without me, how she felt she had no reason to go on if I wasn't in her life. It was disturbing, to say the least. I debated whether or not to reply. On one hand, I felt a sense of responsibility to ensure she and the baby were safe. On the other hand, I knew this was yet another manipulation tactic. She was using my empathy as a weapon, trying to coerce me into staying in a marriage that had already crumbled. Instead of replying, I contacted a lawyer and forwarded all her messages to him. He advised me to document everything and, if necessary, to inform the authorities. The thought of involving the police made me feel sick, but I couldn't ignore the fact that her behavior was escalating. The next day, I received another call from her mother. This time, her voice was filled with anger rather than desperation. "How can you just abandon her like this? She's threatening to hurt herself because of you." "Because of me?" I shot back. "You're blaming me for her actions? For her decisions? She betrayed me, lied to me, and carried another man's child while pretending it was mine. And now you want to make this my fault? No. I'm done being the scapegoat for her mistakes." Her mother tried to argue, but I ended the call before she could continue. I had reached my limit with their attempts to manipulate me. The next few days were eerily quiet. I didn't hear from her or her family, and for a moment, I allowed myself to believe that the storm had finally passed. But that hope was short-lived. Late one evening, I heard a loud knock at my door. My heart sank as I opened it to find her standing there, clutching the baby in her arms. Her face was pale, her eyes swollen from crying. She looked fragile, like a shell of the person I had once known. "Please," she whispered. "I don't know where else to go." I stood frozen, torn between my lingering compassion for her as a person and the overwhelming anger and hurt that her actions had caused. "You shouldn't be here," I said firmly. "This isn't going to change anything." She began to cry, louder this time, begging me to let her in. "I can't do this alone," she sobbed. "He's your baby, even if he's not biologically yours. You've loved him from the start. Please, don't turn your back on us." Her words struck a chord, but I knew better than to let emotions cloud my judgment. I had loved the idea of that child, the life I thought we were building together. But that life didn't exist. It had been a lie from the moment she chose to betray me. "I can't help you," I said, my voice steady. "You need to figure this out for yourself. I won't be a part of this." She collapsed onto the porch, sobbing uncontrollably, clutching the baby to her chest. It was a heartbreaking sight, but I knew I couldn't give in. I couldn't allow myself to be dragged back into a toxic situation, no matter how much it hurt to see her like that. Eventually, I called her brother and asked him to come and take her. He arrived quickly, his face somber as he helped her to her feet. She didn't say another word as he led her away. In the weeks that followed, I finalized the divorce and began the process of moving forward. It wasn't easy. There were days when the weight of it all felt unbearable, when the memories of our life together crept in and made me question everything. But I reminded myself that staying would have been worse, that I deserved a life built on honesty and respect, not lies and betrayal. Her family eventually stopped contacting me, though I occasionally heard through mutual acquaintances that she was struggling. Part of me felt pity for her, but I knew that her struggles were the result of her own choices, not mine. Now, as I sit here reflecting on everything, I feel a sense of closure. The pain is still there, but it no longer defines me. I've learned that sometimes, the hardest thing you can do is walk away from something you once loved. But in doing so, you make space for something better, something real. So, my brothers and sisters, I'm here to ask, am I the asshole for divorcing my cheating wife? No. I know I'm not. I made the only choice I could to protect my heart, my future, and my sense of self. And for that, I have no regrets.